Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March 7th, 2025 episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, just like the Twister movies, it's all about the funnel. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. We're a little short-handed this week because we're recording at an unusual time for us anyways. It's Friday morning, and a good chunk of the team couldn't make it, but the good news is we got the Bureau here for Funnel Week. So we got Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton with us. Hello, Tom.
Hey, Aaron.
And Lee Des Moines Bureau Chief Maya Marchel Hoff is with us. Hello, Maya.
What is up, Aaron?
All right. How's everybody, before we get into it, how's everybody feeling post-funnel? Did we survive just by the hairs of our chin? Thriving? How's everybody feel right now?
I'm here, Aaron.
That's the bar, right?
Yeah.
I am also here.
Yeah.
I am also here.
All right. Okay. Well, like we said, this week's podcast is all about the funnel. This was the first funnel deadline of the 2025 legislative session. Bills had to be approved through at least the committee level in order to remain eligible for further consideration. So that's a pretty low bar to clear. It's literally just the first two steps in the legislative process: a 3-person subcommittee and then that full committee. But still, not all bills survive, and we're going to talk about some of those. But it is the first step in the annual winnowing of legislation that lawmakers can continue to work on it as the session progresses. So Tom and Maya, let's just, look, and for folks tune into our stuff over the weekend, you're going to see some pretty amazing numbers reported on the number of bills that have been introduced this session, and the number of committee and subcommittee meetings that have been held has just been incredible. Maya's either blessed or cursed by not having perspective on this being her first session. I honestly don't know which, because holy moly, this year's been incredible. And then on top of it, we're coming off a momentous 2 weeks at the Capitol, because the week prior was the week, as I'm sure our loyal listeners remember, was when they ran and passed the bill that removed gender identity from the Iowa Civil Rights Act. So we had that taken up all of last week, and then this was Funnel Week, where they just ran an unbelievable amount of bills. I'm not going to ask about any specific bills. I'm going to leave this up to you all. Maya, let's start with you, since, like we said, this was your first Funnel Week on the beat here in Iowa. Give me your impressions first. Just what was it like to you covering that, and were there any moments or bills that stood out to you?
Yeah, like you said, it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because even though this week was extremely hectic with Funnel Week, I feel like the beginning of the session just conditioned me or trained me to expecting this volume of legislation and bills and subcommittees and committees. So,
because you were telling me early in the year about how Iowa's different from Nebraska in that way, which you covered last year. Tell our listeners about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, first of all, Nebraska is a unicameral legislature, and so that means they have one chamber, which is the Senate, and they have 49 lawmakers there. So Iowa has 3 times the number of legislators, and so that's one thing. The second thing is, when I was covering Nebraska last year, in their rule changes at the beginning of the session, they implemented a limit on how many bills a legislator could introduce. So
that sounds
that
like
was
heaven.
So that was also there, but yeah, it's just a completely different process. There aren't really like subcommittees. Everything's a little bit easier to follow and figure out. So
anyway, I interrupted. You were talking about what it was like covering this week.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I went from 49 senators to 150 lawmakers with subcommittees and committees, and no cap on legislation, and different procedural steps for legislation to follow, which are a little bit more complicated. in Nebraska, the rules, like once legislation gets to the floor, it's a little bit more complicated than in Iowa. So that's easier to follow. Floor stuff is easier to follow. But yeah, I mean, in terms, Erin, when you asked this question of bills that stuck out, I mean, my brain went in so many different directions. Like I could talk and talk and talk.
Understandably, yeah.
I guess, I mean, one thing that we were talking about this week, a bill that popped up this week in subcommittee in the Senate, was salary increases for lawmakers and the governor. And we were just falling down rabbit holes with that the other day. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But basically, lawmakers, they're state lawmakers, both Senate and the House, they make the same. Their salaries haven't been increased since 2007, and they make $25,000, which again, Nebraska comparison, Nebraska state senators make $12,000. So, but that's a different situation. But so they make $25,000, and the legislation proposes giving them a $20,000 pay increase. So that would be $45,000. And then the more interesting thing is the salary increase for the governor. Currently, the governor makes $130,000, but it would bump it up almost, it would almost double it. I think it's around like 75% increase, but it would be a $100,000 pay increase, which was really interesting. And when I talked to Senator Schultz, who's running this bill over in the Senate, about, you know, why this pay increase for the governor, he kind of gave reasoning that it helps attract talent or maintain good leadership talent for people that are well qualified to run the state and manage you know, everything going on in Iowa. And that line of reasoning really reminded me of when I was covering the University of Minnesota administration at my student newspaper. That's like the same reasoning that people use for talent retention for university officials. So I hadn't heard that. I'd only heard that in like academia. So that was really interesting. But another thing this week that was really interesting was a bill that would prohibit camping, unauthorized camping or sleeping outside. And, you know, critics of the legislation said that it would criminalize homelessness. But basically, this was heard in the same day in the House and the Senate. And this was also a first for me. I'd never seen a bill die in subcommittee, or at least on one side, not die because everything's not truly dead, I guess, but
Right.
not fail to advance out of a subcommittee. And that was in the Senate. It was a companion bill, same bill on both sides, but you know, both of these committees were packed with advocates for you know, housing and folks that work or support Iowans experiencing homelessness and offering them services, or Iowans themselves who have experienced homelessness. So that was really interesting. The only person that was in favor of the bill was a representative from the Cicero Institute, and they were the ones that kind of pushed for the bill here. They've been pushing for similar legislation across the country. And I believe they kind of helped in the drafting process and putting the legislation together. They're the only ones that were in favor of it. But it advanced out of the House subcommittee with the two Republicans, Representative Holt and Representative Lawler, voting to advance, or I guess not voting, but signing on to advance it. And then in the Senate, Senator Weiner and Senator Sayers, who is a Republican, he did not want to sign on. He said that he didn't agree with the part of the legislation that would fine folks for not wanting to vacate public land where they're sleeping or camping after they're given a warning, and fines could be up to around $800 or around $800. And so he just didn't agree with that. He said that's not fair to people that are down on their luck. That's a lot of money for people that probably can't pay that anyways. So that was just a really fascinating day. And then yesterday, on the House side, that was supposed to be heard in House Judiciary Committee, but I guess it was removed from the agenda.
Yeah. So just to jump in here, what's interesting about that bill and how that all played out is you had Representative Steve Holt, a Republican from Denison, who chairs the House Judiciary Committee and served on that subcommittee that signed off on advancing the bill to the full committee. So just a day earlier on Wednesday, you had Representative Holt speaking in favor of this bill and advancing it for further consideration over the objections of all of these experts who work with people who are unsheltered, saying that this is only going to make the situation worse by, in their words, criminalizing homelessness. Representative Holt pushed back on that and said that the intention of the bill is not to criminalize homelessness or punish people who are unsheltered, but rather encourage them to go into shelters that have supportive services for them, and felt that, well, how do you do that without an enforcement mechanism? And then, the very next day pulls it from the committee agenda and says, this is not going to go forward. It's not going to advance, essentially saying that there's too many problems and too much work that needs to happen to the bill. And, with everything else that they have going on, and with it being funnel week, and, there being other bills and other priorities they want to focus on, they're just not able to work on that piece of legislation to get it to a point to make it workable, which I thought was fascinating, because again, just a day earlier, here's him saying that, look, we're not going to criminalize homelessness. This is trying to create a scenario in which people would be better cared for and be given better opportunities to be in shelters. And then, Thursday morning says, well, never mind. This bill is too problematic. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to this legislation, so we're not going to do anything with it.
Yeah. Although he did say, but continue the conversation, may come back next year, right, Tom?
Right. Yeah, he did. He said, yeah, we'll continue this conversation. Yeah, it could come back next year, but it was just,
but that is that. It was one of the more interesting kind of funnel week,
right?
Progressions. That's the word I'm trying to spit out here.
Yeah. And then I guess, we'll just continue with the House Judiciary Committee. Another thing that stood out to me this week was a bill that they did advance that would subject Iowa law enforcement officers to being charged with a felony for failing to comply with state immigration laws. So they advanced the study bill that would make it a Class D felony for law enforcement officers, including county sheriffs, who knowingly and intentionally fail to comply with federal immigration officers. So a Class D felony is punishable by up to 5 years in jail and a fine up to a little more than $10,000. Pretty steep penalties, it seems like, for law enforcement officers. And then in addition to that, sheriffs, deputies, law enforcement officers in the state who are convicted of the offense would also lose their certification from the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy. Representative Holt did go on to say that he intends to amend the bill to lower the penalty to a serious misdemeanor. But, it's interesting. Opponents, say that this bill, again, imposes severe penalties on law enforcement for, again, failing to provide reasonable or necessary enforcement assistance to federal immigration officers, which seems open to interpretation, right? It seems kind of pretty broad as to how, to interpret that, and that their argument is that could lead to officers being jailed for misunderstandings, miscommunication, or a lack of resources to provide enforcement assistance. But Representative Holt, cited tragic murders involving immigrants that are not authorized to be in the country that have grabbed national headlines, including victims Lake and Riley and Jocelyn, man, I'm blanking on the last name, Jocelyn Nungaray. President Trump, I believe, mentioned her during his joint address to Congress earlier this week, and advocated for the bill's provision to ensure public safety, arguing that, these tragic killings and murders, potentially could have been avoided if local law enforcement officers had, complied with immigration detainer requests from ICE, from U.S. immigration enforcement agencies.
And that one was interesting too, Tom, because that process started out, that topic, with a different bill that would have required law enforcement agencies to enter into a written, and I forget the legal term, but basically a written agreement with federal immigration authorities to ensure that they would comply. And that bill got killed over concerns that law enforcement officials
are going to be stretched
about, about resources.
Right.
And so Representative Holt said, okay, I understand that. I appreciate that. We're going to kill that bill. And then literally the next day came back with that one instead as a means to address this issue that they felt needs addressing.
It's worth noting, the reason that this all came up is because the Winneshiek County Sheriff, who's a Republican, announced in a social media post that he would not comply with non-warrant immigration detainer requests by federal immigration officials. There are concerns from law enforcement officers about essentially kind of their legal exposure in honoring these detainer requests when there's not a warrant. So, ICE sends a request to local law enforcement to hold somebody, I believe, up to 48 hours after their release date, after normally they're supposed to be, released. You're arrested, you're booked, right? And then, you're depending on the crime or whatever, are released if you can post bail or bond, or depending on the level of the crime, you can be released on your own recognizance, right? So ICE can send a request to local law enforcement and say, hey, hold this person for another up to 48 hours so that we can have time to determine whether or not we need to take them into federal custody for deportation proceedings because of their immigration status, or maybe a question about their immigration status. And again, it's led to legal issues, and constitutional questions of, well, can we hold on to this person beyond, their release date if there's, again, no warrant or no other kind of supporting evidence or probable cause to say that they should be detained beyond the period that, somebody normally.
Yeah. That was definitely one of the interesting ones. Maya, I want to go back to real quick the salary bill that you mentioned, because that was a fascinating one too. And it's an interesting topic, isn't it? And you and I talked about this a little bit during the week. We try not to look at these things in a vacuum, and you compare it to other states. And it can be jarring to hear, oh my gosh, you're going to raise the governors or legislators' pay by how much or whatever it is. But, maybe if you look at it comparative to other states, especially in the region, it makes a little more sense. Anyways, it's just kind of a fascinating debate. But there's also a political element to this too, right? Is even for the people who want it, can you get enough people who are going to vote on a bill that is going to give themselves essentially a pay raise? Now, the one way they try to address that is it doesn't take effect until 2027, which is after the next election. But there's still the optics of that, right, Maya?
Right, yeah, definitely. And that kind of came up during the subcommittee, that argument of, this isn't going to be a partisan issue. It's going to be newer members versus older members that, newer members that don't really, I guess maybe some folks don't kind of see how, or have have experienced as much stress as like older members, older meaning they've just been in the legislature longer, of having the financial constraints, I guess, of having to make ends meet while working this job. And that was one of the arguments for this, that this could bar folks who are either lower income or younger from serving in the legislature, and just raising that would, offer more flexibility to folks that maybe do want to represent their district. A person that testified in the subcommittee was former Republican Representative Phil Thompson. He argued that when he started in the legislature, he was single, he didn't have a kid, so it was easier for him. But as he served over the years, he became married, and then he had a kid, and then, that $25,000 salary was just not sufficient to support his family. So that was another interesting side of it. But yeah,
Yeah.
definitely the optics don't, you can just see the campaign ads in your head for the next, like Representative blank voted to double his salary. Like
Exactly.
you can hear that. So that's
Exactly.
the
And
hesitation. But
that got us going down our discussion of it made me recall the gas tax, the state gas tax in increase back in, and I was trying to remember the exact year. It might have been all the way back to 2013. Anyways, it's been a while, and that was back when it was divided government. So Republicans had majority in the House, Democrats had majority in the Senate. So obviously, anything that both chambers passed and went to the governor had to be agreed on by both Democrats and Republicans. And I thought of it because I to that last point there, I recalled that one of the agreements we were told that legislators reached was, we are not going to call this bill up. There was a proposal to raise the gas tax by 10 cents per gallon, and it was requested by the DOT because they said that we have a funding shortfall each year. We need more state gas tax revenue to fix our roads, bridges, etc. And Iowa had at the time a spectacularly awful rating in its bridges across the state. The legislative leaders said, we are not going to debate and vote on this bill unless a majority of each party approves it. So what, and if that's not clear, what I mean there is Republicans, a majority of Republicans in each chamber had to vote yes on it, and a majority of Democrats in each chamber had to vote yes on it before the leaders would agree to call it up and actually have that vote. And the reason was exactly that, because they didn't want to take a vote on that. And then if all of a sudden one party voted for it more than the other, inevitably in the campaign ads, exactly what Maya described would happen. So this kind of bill reminded me of that. Gosh, there was one other thing in there, Maya, that you said that I thought I wanted to come back to, and now it'll lose me. Maybe it'll randomly come up as we keep going. Was there anything else, Maya? Any other big bills?
I guess one piece of legislation or pieces of legislation that interested me was stuff around appropriating money from the state fund to Double Up Food Bucks program, which is a program that can double the amount of money that a SNAP recipient has to purchase fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh produce and stuff like that. Before this, the program currently doesn't receive any state funding. It's funded primarily through private donations and stuff like that. And the one piece of legislation on the Senate side, it passed. It's just a $1 million appropriation to that program. That's it. But over on the House side, there's a $1 million appropriation, but it's contingent on whether the USDA is able to provide a waiver to exempt some certain foods from the list of SNAP eligible foods. And the original bill had just a list of everything, the different products that would be eligible, and then anything outside of that wouldn't be for SNAP recipients. So it included stuff like grains, real dairy, real meat, just stuff like that. And advocates who work in food pantries or work to address food insecurity across the state argue that it would ban like 2/3 of the grocery store, and it would just make things a lot more difficult, especially for families that don't have time to cook things from scratch every night, or if there are picky kiddos that just like don't want to eat vegetables all the time and they want pizza and stuff. But and then so that passed out of subcommittee, and then that came to committee and it advanced out as well. And the chair of House Health and Human Services, Representative Carter Nordman, he he said it would just, the point of it wasn't to ban foods or make less foods available. He said it's helpful in addressing the rates of obesity in the state, and how the rates of obesity in the state impact cancer rates. And so that was, his argument. And then after he included an amendment which would basically strike the part of the bill that listed all of the eligible foods. And he said it would just leave it up to the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services to kind of sort out which foods would be eligible. And so it would just basically leave it up to them. But I just thought that was a really interesting thing, that I was talking to anti-food insecurity advocates, right? And they argued that this bill was holding the Double Up Food Bucks funding hostage because, if the USDA doesn't grant the waiver, then it's dead. And if they do, then it's like, okay, we have this $1 million for the program, but there's a whole lot of foods that families can't access with their SNAP benefits. And then, the argument of in rural areas, a lot of places that could limit people even more because they don't have as big of a selection. And so what do these certain eligibility requirements mean that could limit it even more, people's options in rural areas? So it was just really interesting. And, folks that work at food pantries argued that the usage of them is just, it's going up year after year. You're seeing a lot more families coming in, and, so as prices go up. So it's just a really interesting thing to follow.
Yep. All right, Tom, how about you? Other than the House Judiciary stuff that you already talked about, what else stood out to you during your funnel week?
Yeah, I guess one thing that stood out to me, although I think it's probably something that you covered more than I did, were bills related to vaccination. So okay, you're gonna have to refresh my memory on this, because even though it's Friday, it feels like Monday and Tuesday were months ago.
3 years ago.
Yeah. But okay, so on the Senate side, the bill started out as a prohibition on mRNA vaccines in the state. So,
Correct.
think of the COVID vaccine, right? And so that obviously grabbed a lot of headlines and caused a lot of concern and consternation about, what this would do in terms of vaccinating people in the state against, potential deadly diseases. What's the reason for this bill? What's the impetus for it? What's driving this? Why would we, exempt vaccines that have been proven to be safe and effective? And then
and the impact on research as well.
Well, and then so on the House side, they pushed a bill that would have Erin, jump in here.
That was the House bill, was the legal indemnity one.
That's right.
Yep. So it would, and this I'll do this as quickly as possible because it's a long backstory. But in the mid '80s, the federal government passed legal protections for vaccine manufacturers to kind of shield them from lawsuits because they were facing so many lawsuits. There was concern that they would start to become hesitant to research and develop new vaccines, which obviously would be concerning for the greater public health. And if we're not developing new vaccines, going to be subjected to all these diseases. So they provided them some legal protections with this federal law but then also created a federal fund, which is funded by an excise tax on the manufacturers, from which if someone claims a vaccine injury and can prove it, then they are awarded whatever, a settlement. And so people, and that was made to thread the needle between settling with people who claim a vaccine injury, but also providing legal protections to vaccine manufacturers so they're not afraid to do their work. And what this House bill would have done is say, if you're going to administer a vaccine, in any vaccine in the state, not just mRNA ones, any vaccine in this state, you have to forego that federal legal protection, which would subject them to those lawsuits again. Back to you, Tom.
Ultimately, though, neither of those bills ended up advancing, but it was just interesting, that they would bring this forward, and the predictable backlash that legislation received. I think it was just interesting, kind of again the focus from Republicans on vaccines, especially given what we're seeing in other parts of the country with measles outbreaks, and the debate and discussion that's been going on around the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary. And
yeah, so sorry, I was just saying, to your point on what's going on around the country, that was mentioned in both the subcommittees about the young child in Texas, I believe it was, who passed away from measles.
Right. Yeah. So the timing of it was interesting, and seemed a little, I guess, peculiar. The other interesting thing, and this did not survive the funnel, but a proposal to get rid of the outdoor recreation trust fund that was approved by voters back in 2010, but that lawmakers have never funded. And instead repurpose that fund, raise the sales tax, the mechanism that would have funded that trust fund approved by voters. Instead, use that sales tax to provide, it was property tax relief, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So it was an interesting proposal that seemed to meet almost immediate resistance and hesitation in the House. So it was a Senate proposal, Senate Republican proposal, that almost
with a good chunk of them. Sorry, Tom, with a good chunk of Senate Republicans signed on to it. Yeah,
right. That met almost immediate resistance and skepticism in the House. Along the lines of, so we're just going to completely ignore the will of voters, and essentially say outright that, look, this thing that voters approved, never going to happen. We've sat on it and drug our feet for more than
years.
Yeah, more than a decade, right? And essentially this would be an acknowledgement of, like, yeah, this thing voters wanted us to do, we're never going to do it. It's never going to happen. And instead, we're going to raise one tax to lower a different tax.
Yeah, raise the sales tax to
raise the sales tax to provide property tax relief. And
And the argument there was, well, hey, because it would require a constitutional amendment, obviously, because that's how the first one was passed, was, hey, this ultimately goes to the voters, which is true. But you're right, Tommy. I had the same reaction. That was fascinating, given this, and not just passed by voters, but passed overwhelmingly. It was in the mid to high 60% that got approved back in 2010, right? And a lot of people argue, and I think you could comfortably make the argument. I'm fine with hearing people try to argue otherwise, but you can make the argument with voters, when they took that vote, the language said what it said. But you can pretty easily argue that voters were saying, I not only approve you creating this trust fund, I want you to fund it by raising the sales tax to do it too. Now, that's not technically what the language says. So that's
Said,
why
right.
why it hasn't happened. But yeah, so to take something that passed with that much support by the electorate and say, never mind, let's just throw that in trash can and do this instead. That was something.
Right. And then yeah, go back to the electorate, go back to voters and asks them, for approval to, essentially do that and instead, raise the sales tax to provide property tax relief. It was an interesting proposal.
Yeah, and to your point, there was a lot of opposition, obviously, from folks interested in conservation, recreation, just outdoors recreation, that kind of stuff, water quality.
Water quality, yeah.
Yeah. The lone and major group supportive of it was the Farm Bureau, because Farm Bureau likes to see anything that lowers property taxes effectively. So. Sorry, go ahead.
It's worth noting, however, that the taxpayer advocacy groups, though, were not registered in favor of that for reasons that we mentioned earlier. Right, you're still going to increase taxes.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something there, Maya?
Oh yeah, I was just going to kind of say that it was interesting to see this issue. It wasn't partisan. It was basically, it was kind of farmers and then everyone that you just listed in that bucket of conservation, water quality, outdoors. Ducks Unlimited was against it. So that was just really interesting to see. And of course, farmers, they argued about, lowering property taxes, but they also expressed concern of the DNR, the state government coming and acquiring more and more land. And they were just not comfortable with that because some that were in they're third generation farmers. They've seen some of their land be acquired by DNR for different purposes. But Iowa, I think I said this in a couple of podcasts ago, the Iowa government owns, where they're ranking nationally of state government ownership of land. They rank near the bottom. They compared to other states, they don't own as much land as other states. They're right near the bottom. So it's just interesting.
Yep. Yeah. The one that I will add was, and Maya was relieved to know that her home state of Minnesota will remain whole, because one bill that did not pass through the funnel this week was the proposal to annex isn't the right word. It's some kind of purchase agreement, and forgive me for not remembering the details now, but essentially what it said is Iowa would take on a bottom swath of the state of Minnesota and basically raise Iowa's northern border there. But I have heard whispers that bill still might come back in another form post funnel as maybe an economic development bill or something along those lines. So stay tuned. Maybe Minnesota's not all the way safe just yet, Maya.
Oh boy, I was really, really, really worried.
Yeah, that one didn't a subcommittee was scheduled and got canceled, and so they didn't even have the sub, which that's fairly unusual. We kind of got degrees of unusual here, and I would say in reverse order, it's somewhat unusual for a bill to be put on a committee agenda and get pulled, which, like we described, happened with a couple of these. That doesn't never happen, but it's somewhat rare. Maya mentioned the kind a little more rare, a little less common, is when a subcommittee is held, but they don't even advance it out of the subcommittee. That's pretty rare. It has happened. I couldn't tell you an exact bill off the top of my head, but I know that has happened before, where they'll have the subcommittee and then just say at the end, we don't even have two of us to pass it. We're going to shelve it.
Gender identity last year.
That's right. Before it passed this year, that's what happened to that.
Before it passed this year, last year they held a subcommittee. It wasn't the same legislation. The bill didn't do the same thing. The bill that
it had the same goal, but it had
the same goal, but it was a different mechanism. And they had a House subcommittee hearing on it. It was an hour-long House subcommittee. It was extremely contentious, loud protesters, as you can imagine, and ultimately, none of the three members of the subcommittee Right.
Wow.
Nobody.
Right.
The subcommittee unanimously declined to sign off on advancing the legislation, saying that it was too problematic.
Yeah, that's really rare. And then you have, to circle all the way back, you had what happened here was they didn't even make it to the subcommittee. They scheduled it, put it on the calendar, and then the subcommittee got canceled. We never saw the bill again. I had also heard that there was a state lawmaker from Minnesota planning to come down to testify on that, so that would have been fascinating. Maybe we'll still get to see that if what I heard was true. And if that does happen, we'll talk about it on a future episode of On Iowa Politics. Before I wrap up, that should do it for our funnel week discussion. Did we miss any huge things? Leave anything out before I let us go, Tom?
Well, I was just going to kind of put a bow on this and just talk about the volume of bills that we have seen introduced and get subcommittees this legislative session. So, I mean, depending on how you're counting it, it's anywhere from 1,400 to 1,800,
almost 1,900. Yep,
almost 1,900 bills that have been introduced just this far in the legislative session. So just before the first funnel deadline, we've had almost 2,000 bills filed. I mean,
and we got 2 months to go.
I mean, compare that to last session. All of last session, there were 1,200 bills?
Yeah, if you're using the 1,400 number, it was just a little bit less than that 2 years ago, and about 1,200 last year. So we're already more bills, a third of the way through the session, halfway through the session, whatever we are now, than all of each of the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Great. Crazy. Yeah. The volume's been crazy. Watch for more details like that. As I said, in our coverage over the weekend, we're going to make a note of that. And it was interesting to see because we've kind of anecdotally been talking about that. Those of us who have covered the legislature in previous years, anecdotally talking about, man, this just feels like there's so many more bills. And so when we got to the funnel here, it seemed like a natural time to kind of do an accounting of that. And the anecdotes were data. It's been incredible. And we'll see if that continues post first funnel or if that kind of tapers off a little bit here. I honestly don't know what to expect. I guess we'll see. All right. That'll do it. I know what we're rooting for, at the very least. I know what those of us on the podcast hope, but we'll see what happens. That'll do it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. Thanks so much for joining us. If you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice or on YouTube, where you should also smash that like button. And you can find the podcast as well each week on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. I am particular to the Gazette.com, but I'm sure Maya would encourage you to go to QCtimes.com or is it WCFC Courier? Anyways, the Courier, all those papers websites. You can find the podcast there as well. Now that you listen to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox, you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, the aforementioned thegazette.com. And lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For the skeleton crew, hopefully we're full force again next week. For Tom Barton, Maya Marchel, Hoff, and our producer Bailey.cichon, I'm Erin Murphy. Be well, everyone, and be good.